Mercy General Hospital in Houston, fluorescent lights humming over linoleum floors slick with antiseptic, the smell of iodine mixing with burnt coffee. 3 years. That's how long Brooke Sullivan has moved through these corridors with the kind of quiet competence that goes unnoticed because it never fails. She doesn't fumble. She doesn't forget. She doesn't ask for credit. She simply appears at the bedside when needed, hand steady, voice calm, and does the work that keeps the emergency department from collapsing into chaos every single shift. The thing about invisible competence is that it becomes invisible to everyone, especially to the people counting on it the most. Dr. Sterling rules the ER the way generals rule small armies. 43 years old, Columbia Medical School, 3 prior positions at prestigious teaching hospitals, and a reputation for operational excellence that he mentions every third conversation. His white coat costs more than most nurses make in a week, and the way he wears it suggests he knows this. The emergency department exists because he allows it to exist. The protocols are his protocols. The decisions are his decisions. When he sweeps past the nursing station, the energy shifts. People sit straighter. Voices drop. Brooke has watched him reduce a resident to near tears with a 3-word observation delivered in front of a waiting room full of patients. She has watched him praise a nurse 1 week and systematically undermine her confidence the next. The man understands institutional power the way a concert pianist understands strings. He knows which ones to pull and exactly how hard. Today, like most days, he hasn't looked at Brooke Sullivan long enough to see her. She moves through the morning shift with the fluid precision of someone whose muscle memory runs deeper than most people's conscious decisions. At 6:38 a.m., she's already checked 3 patients, titrated oxygen on a coptic exacerbation, and placed a peripheral for on a dehydrated construction worker without causing him a second of unnecessary pain. The nurse who works beside her, Marcus, once asked how she made it look so easy. Brooke said nothing. She simply positioned her hand at a 45-degree angle to the vein, didn't wait for the tourniquet mark to fully appear, and slid the needle in with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing what's underneath the skin before the needle gets there. Some things you don't learn from textbooks. At 8:15 a.m., during the brief window when the overnight admits have been triaged and the morning surge hasn't yet arrived, Brooke opens her locker in the break room. The space is sparse, a change of scrubs in navy blue, a half-empty container of ibuprofen, a thermos that hasn't held coffee in 2 days. And in the back corner, tucked where no one can see unless they know to look, a pair of combat boots. Army issue, the leather cracked and faded from years of desert silt and blood and sweat that no amount of cleaning fully removes. The laces are still tied the way he tied them 6 years ago, before the convoy turned left instead of right, before the IED detonated 7 feet from the vehicle, before everything changed. Brooke's right hand trembles slightly as it reaches for them, always does, even now, even when the grip is supposed to be controlled. She steadies the tremor with a measured breath, the way she's done 10,000 times in 10,000 moments when she couldn't afford to shake. The boots are worn at the heel. Scuffed at the toe. They carry the weight of 6 deployments, the last one to Sanjin where everything that mattered most decided to stay behind. Sullivan. Brooke's hand closes on the boot, and she doesn't flinch. Doesn't turn immediately. Takes one more breath that no one hears, then stands and closes the locker with a soft click. Dr. Sterling stands in the doorway of the break room, his posture suggesting he's already conducting rounds in his head and has no time for subordinates who stare into lockers instead of monitoring cardiac monitors. His eyes, sharp, blue, cold with the specific coldness of a man who has never questioned his own judgment, pass over her with the kind of attention you give a piece of furniture you're planning to replace. Bed 6 needs vitals. Now. Not when you're finished admiring your belongings. Yes, doctor. Brooke's voice is level. Respectful. The voice of someone who understands her place in the hierarchy and has made peace with it. She moves past him toward the hallway, and if her jaw tightens slightly, it's barely perceptible. It's the kind of micro-expression that requires someone to actually be watching to notice, and Sterling is already turning away, his mind already elsewhere, already composing the dismissive observation he'll deliver to the resident who made the mistake of suggesting an alternative diagnostic approach 15 minutes ago. What Sterling doesn't see as he walks away is the moment Brooke's hand releases from her side and her fingers flex once, a controlled, deliberate release of tension that mimics the motion of gripping something that requires all her strength to hold. What he doesn't see is how her gait shifts from the deferential shuffle of a nurse being corrected to something else entirely, something economical, purposeful, the way someone walks when they know exactly where they're going and why. What he doesn't see, because he never bothered to look close enough, is the scar tissue visible on her collarbone where her scrubs dip, the kind of scarring that doesn't come from a car accident or a fall, the kind that comes from blast fragments and surgeries conducted in field hospitals under conditions that no American civilian hospital would ever tolerate. The ER fills gradually over the next 2 hours. A 68-year-old woman with chest pain, Sterling orders an EKG, then spends 10 minutes explaining to her why her concerns about atypical presentation are statistically unlikely. A motorcycle accident victim with a badly fractured arm, Sterling arrives, observes Brooke wrapping the splint with anatomical precision, and says nothing, which somehow feels worse than saying something. A migraine patient in the far bay, Sterling tells them the ER isn't a pain clinic and their neurologist should handle this, all while standing 5 feet from Brooke, who has already called neuro and already knows they're backed up for 4 hours. She doesn't correct him. She simply makes the patient comfortable, dims the lights, and continues her work. By 11:53 a.m., Brooke is at the nursing station reviewing lab results for a diabetic ketoacidosis case when Sterling appears beside her. Not greeting her. Just appearing, the way authority appears without announcement. He reviews her charting with the kind of scrutiny that suggests he's looking for mistakes rather than verifying competence. Your note here, he says, pointing to her documentation of a patient's mental status assessment, is vague. What specifically made you concerned about altered cognition? Brooke turns toward him, her face composed. Patient's orientation to time had degraded over the 3 hours I've been monitoring him. At 9:11 a.m. he knew it was Tuesday. At 10:15, he said Wednesday. At 11 o'clock, he couldn't place the date at all. He remained oriented to person and place. The pattern suggests metabolic rather than acute neurological, which aligns with his glucose reading of 687. Sterling's eyes narrow slightly. Not because her assessment is wrong, it's correct, it's precisely the kind of detailed observation that constitutes excellent nursing, but because something in her tone has shifted. For just a moment, Brooke had sounded like she was explaining an analysis, not defending a notation. Like her observations held weight independent of his approval. He doesn't like this. His fingers tap once on the desk, and his mouth tightens at the corners. Your job is to report observations. The interpretation is mine. See that you remember the distinction. Understood, Doctor. 3 words. Soft. Compliant. Complete. But when Sterling walks away, his shoulders are slightly more rigid than they were before. He didn't get the reaction he was looking for, no defensive explanation, no justification, no crack in the facade that would have confirmed his suspicion that she was precisely what he believed her to be, competent enough to be useful, but not so competent that she should ever confuse her role with his own. An ambulance siren wails outside, growing closer with the persistent wail that means incoming trauma. The ER team shifts into position, beds are prepped, equipment is staged, the controlled chaos of trained professionals preparing for the unknown. Brooke moves toward the trauma bay without instruction, knowing the protocol, knowing what comes next, knowing with the kind of certainty that comes from experience rather than training that the next few hours will test everything. Her hand, when she pulls on fresh gloves, is perfectly steady. Whatever trembled over those boots in her locker is contained now, compressed, stored away in whatever compartment she's learned to seal. Dr. Sterling stands at the center of the trauma bay, white coat pristine, hands positioned as if he's already performing surgery. He has no idea what's about to arrive through those doors. He has no idea that in exactly 19 minutes, his assumptions about the quiet nurse in the blue scrubs will be tested in a way that will either confirm his judgment completely or shatter it entirely. He has no idea that he's standing in a room with someone whose hands have performed emergency procedures in field hospitals where the electricity runs on generators and the anesthesia is whatever they can spare from supplies meant to last 3 times as long. He has no idea. And that's the thing about absolute authority. It makes you certain you can see everything. It makes you certain that you understand who people are simply by observing their place in your hierarchy. It makes you unable to recognize a legend standing 3 feet away, moving like someone who has already survived the worst and found that survival requires no announcement. The ambulance doors burst open. The ambulance doors burst open and the young soldier came through on a stretcher, his fatigue soaked dark with blood, shrapnel embedded across his chest like a constellation of embedded stars. His name was Patterson, 19 years old, straight out of Sanjin Valley where the Taliban didn't take prisoners and neither did the dust. His mother gripped the side rail, her fingernails white against the metal, while his father, a retired army colonel with shoulders that never quite relaxed, moved beside the paramedics with the precision of someone who had seen this movie before and knew how it ended. Brooke met them at Trauma Bay 3, already gloved, already reading the paramedic report, GSW and fragmentation wounds, field dressings intact, transport time 12 minutes from forward operating base. She took his vitals before Sterling arrived. BP 118/72. Heart rate 97, climbing. Respiratory rate 22. His jugular vein was distended slightly, visible even through the mud caked on his neck. She noted it. Wrote it down. Listened to his heart with her stethoscope, the flat metallic disc cold against his exposed chest, and heard the textbook pattern of normal beats, but something underneath it. A muffling. Like wind chimes heard through a closed window. She pressed 2 fingers against his carotid and felt the pulse flutter unevenly, a hesitation that shouldn't be there. Dr. Sterling appeared with his standard entourage, 2 residents trailing like satellites, his white coat pressed with the precision of a man who believed wrinkles indicated weakness. He glanced at the monitor, scanned the injuries with a speed that suggested he'd already made his decision before seeing the patient. Superficial wounds, he announced, tone final. Shrapnel-penetrated soft tissue only. No thoracic compromise. Discharge him by evening. We need the bed for VIP incoming tomorrow, CEO's grandson, motor vehicle accident, higher priority. He turned to leave. Brooke caught his arm in the hallway. She kept her voice low, clinical, careful, the voice of someone choosing every word with the weight of a sniper selecting distance. Doctor, I'm seeing signs of possible cardiac tamponade. Muffled heart sounds, hypertension trending downward, jugular vein distension. The shrapnel trajectory suggests possible pericardial involvement. Sterling stopped. He turned slowly, eyebrows rising as if she'd just announced she could levitate. The 2 residents exchanged glances. One shifted backward, creating distance. Are you a cardiologist now, Sullivan? His voice pitched upward, theatrical, designed to carry to the nurse's station 15 feet away. Or just playing one on television? He stepped closer, his presence pressing against the space between them like a physical weight. This is exactly why I don't trust nurses who think watching too many episodes of Grey's Anatomy qualifies them to practice medicine. Every patient who arrives here is sick. That doesn't make your observations diagnostic. 3 nurses at the station looked down at their charts simultaneously. The sound of typing stopped. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electrical dirge. In the patient's room, Sterling spoke to the ranger's mother with theatrical sympathy, his voice dropping to the tone reserved for grieving family members. I sincerely apologize for Nurse Sullivan's alarmism. She tends toward emotional attachment rather than clinical judgment. These young soldiers are trained to ignore pain. She's misinterpreting normal shock response as something more serious. Your son is stable. Completely stable. He gestured toward the monitors as proof, already moving toward the door. Brooke stood at the bedside. The ranger's mother was nodding, desperate to believe him, her hands finally unclenching from the rail. His father watched with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read between official statements and tactical reality. Brooke took one measured breath. The kind of breath that had kept her alive in field hospitals where the wounded outnumbered the supplies. She felt heat rise to her cheeks but kept her voice level, pitched only to the family. Mrs. Patterson, I recommend a second opinion. A cardiology consult. Standard precaution given the shrapnel distribution. Sterling's face darkened like a storm moving in from the Gulf. He turned back, eyes locking onto hers with the intensity of a man whose authority had been questioned in front of witnesses. "Step outside. Now." The hallway was empty except for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant beep of monitors. Sterling walked directly to the nurse's station and picked up a dry erase marker. The public board, the one where tasks were listed, where violations were posted, where every staff member saw their name written in bold letters, hung on the wall in full view. He wrote in large, careful letters, Sullivan, scope of practice violation, overstepping physician authority, automatic review triggered. He didn't look at her. Didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. Two nurses glanced toward Brooke, then quickly away. One leaned over to whisper something to the other, her voice low but not low enough. The words insubordination and trouble reached Brooke's ears clearly. Everyone heard. That was the point. The break room at shift change smelled like stale coffee and the ghost of someone's microwaved lunch from 3 hours prior. Brooke sat at the corner table, her sandwich untouched beside her, staring into a cup of black coffee so old it had developed an iridescent film across the surface. She had taken a seat that would have been her usual place, the table where four colleagues typically joined her, where they talked about shift rotations and difficult families and the small victories that kept nurses alive, but somehow that geography had shifted. Four colleagues arrived within minutes of each other. All found reasons to sit elsewhere. One claimed the table by the window was better light for the paperwork. Another suddenly needed to use the bathroom. A third discovered an urgent text message that required her immediate attention in the far corner of the room. By the time Sterling passed the open doorway with the hospital administrator, a gray-haired man whose job was protecting institutional liability, Brooke was utterly alone. "She's exactly the kind of liability we can't afford," Sterling said, voice pitched to carry naturally, as if he wasn't aware the break room was occupied. "Questions every order. Undermines physician authority. Thinks she knows better than the attending. It's insubordination wrapped in concern trolling, and it's destructive to team dynamics." The administrator nodded, his expression professional, detached. "We'll document everything. Build the file systematically." Brooke stared at her reflection in the black coffee. She watched a single tear slide down her cheek, heat, not sadness, the body's response to the injustice of being invisible and then suddenly hypervisible for all the wrong reasons. She wiped it without breaking her gaze from the doorway, without allowing her focus to shift, without giving the satisfaction of visible reaction to the man turning back to confirm she'd heard every word. Then she met his eyes as he glanced back through the glass partition. Held his gaze. Steady. Calm. "Sometimes the right call looks like insubordination to people who've never had to make one that mattered," she said quietly, speaking to the room but addressing him with absolute precision. Sterling's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle flexing along his mandible. His eyes narrowed. He turned away from the glass, his shoulders stiffening as he walked down the corridor, and Brooke realized she had just crossed a line from which there was no return. She had challenged him not just professionally but personally, had invoked a truth he couldn't deny without acknowledging his own limitations, and now he would decide that insubordination needed consequences more permanent than a write-up on a public board. She picked up her untouched sandwich, wrapped it carefully in plastic, and set it in the trash. The break room remained silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Nobody looked at her. Nobody would, for a long time. The shift continued around her like a river flowing around a stone, necessary, professional, coldly impersonal. Brooke found herself reassigned to the supply closet by day's end, Sterling's way of removing her from the clinical floor, a petty punishment that felt like a physical push. She inventoried bandages and restocked for drips, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind calculated the mathematics of his escalation. He wasn't finished. This was stage 2, the strategic move, the public humiliation, the institutional documentation designed to create a record that would justify whatever came next. She had no idea that stage 3 was already being constructed in a room 4 floors above her head, or that 4 hours from now, alarms would scream in a way that would force every choice she'd ever made, every decision she'd buried under 3 years of careful invisibility, to surface at once, violent and undeniable. For hours later, the alarm screamed. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 3. The call came through the overhead like a siren that turned every head in the emergency department, and Brooke's body moved before her brain caught up, muscle memory that had nothing to do with 3 years at Mercy General and everything to do with field hospitals where the difference between movement and hesitation meant someone's child went home or didn't. She was in the supply closet when the alarm hit. Sterling had reassigned her there 20 minutes after the public board posting, a petty punishment disguised as logistics. Inventory duty. Count the gauze. Organize the syringes. A nursery task for someone he decided was no longer trusted with actual patients. The message was clear without being stated: you exist here now, in the dark, organizing things no one cares about, because you challenged me and this is what happens. The closet smelled like bleach and plastic packaging, the fluorescent tube overhead casting everything in that sickly pale light that made time feel suspended. When the alarm pierced through the walls, Brooke didn't hesitate. She dropped the inventory clipboard, it clattered against the tile floor with a sound like a gunshot in the silence, and moved toward the door. Her legs carried her down the hallway at a speed that was just shy of running, fast enough to matter, controlled enough to not draw attention, the way someone moves when they know exactly where they're going and why. Trauma Bay 3. The Ranger's room. She didn't push through the main doors, she slipped in through the side entrance where the nurses came and went, and what she saw stopped every thought except the ones that mattered. Patterson's monitor was screaming a rhythm that should have been stable, oxygen saturation dropping like a stone down a well, 88, 85, 79. His chest was rising and falling but getting shallower, the kind of breathing that meant his lungs weren't moving air anymore, just moving the memory of it. His mother was pressed against the wall, hand over her mouth. His father's face had gone the color of old concrete. Sterling stood 3 feet from the bed, frozen. Not thinking. Not moving. Just standing there with his hands at his sides and his mouth slightly open, the posture of a man whose clinical knowledge had just stopped being useful and whose authority meant nothing when confronted with a patient actively dying in front of him. His eyes were tracking the monitor like it might tell him what to do if he just stared hard enough. It wouldn't. It never did. Brooke crossed the room in footsteps. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce herself. She didn't waste breath on words. Her hands moved on their own, steady as a surgical laser, pulling on nitrile gloves with a snap that was louder than any voice. Someone was saying her name, she registered that distantly, the way you notice rain when you're already soaked. The resident tried to step forward. "I'll handle this," she said, and her voice came out flat and precise and nobody questioned it. She found what she needed without looking, a spinal needle, size 22 gauge, the kind you'd use for a lumbar puncture, and she'd used it for something far different in a trauma tent in Sanjin when a Marine captain took shrapnel through the anterior chest wall and his lungs filled with blood because his pericardium had split like overripe fruit. The needle slid between her fingers like it had never left, like her hands remembered exactly what they were supposed to do when a human being's heart was swimming in fluid that should never be there. She prepped the insertion site with iodine solution, her movements precise and economical, and she didn't think about Sterling behind her or the monitor screaming or the ranger's mother who had started crying because someone was finally doing something instead of just standing there. The needle went in at the 4th intercostal space, right of the midclavicular line, and she felt the moment it breached the pericardium, that subtle give, like pushing through a soap bubble that had been inflated with blood. The hiss. That was the sound that meant she'd gotten it right. Air escaping. Pressure releasing. The monitor began to climb almost immediately, 80, 84, 88, 91. The ranger's oxygen saturation came back like someone had turned the lights on. His chest wall expanded properly. His color shifted from the gray of someone who was about to stop being alive to the pink of someone who still belonged to the world. Brooke withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd inserted it. Someone needed to call for an actual pericardiocentesis kit, something with fluoroscopy guidance, something proper. But those for minutes, the ones between the point where Patterson was dying and the point where the hiss of air meant he wasn't anymore, those belonged entirely to hands that had learned their work in places where proper equipment was a luxury and improvisation was the difference between soldiers going home and soldiers going into boxes. Sterling finally moved. Not toward the patient. Toward her. "Security," he said, and his voice had lost all its weight, all its authority, become something thin and reedy and desperate. "Security, now." 2 officers came through the door within 30 seconds. Not running. Just walking with a deliberate pace of people who had been called to remove someone from a trauma bay for reasons that would be explained later. Sterling's face had gone the color of spoiled milk. His hands were shaking. He pointed at Brooke like she was a contamination vector, like her presence alone was infectious. "Escort her from the building," he said. "Now. Before she reaches the ICU." They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. She walked ahead of them with her shoulders back and her eyes forward, past Patterson's parents, his father's eyes finding hers for one fraction of a second, recognition there, gratitude there, something that said he understood that something impossible had just happened, and down the corridor toward the elevators. Behind her, she heard Sterling ordering someone to update the patient's chart, heard him raising his voice about unauthorized procedures and scope of practice violations, heard him already constructing the narrative that would turn the moment when she'd kept a young soldier alive into evidence of her crimes. By morning, her badge was gone. She sat across from the HR director in an office that smelled like stale coffee and corporate caution, and the director, a woman named Patricia Chen whose hands trembled slightly as she pushed papers across the desk, wouldn't meet her eyes. "Administrative leave, pending investigation," Chen said, her voice that particular pitch of bureaucratic apology that meant she'd already made her decision and it wasn't going to be the one Brooke needed. The badge and ID sat on the desk between them, deactivated, a physical representation of a boundary Brooke had just crossed from employee to problem. "Dr. Sterling has filed a formal complaint with the State Nursing Board," Chen continued, each word carefully chosen like she'd rehearsed this speech in the parking lot. "For practicing medicine without a license. He's also contacted 3 board members about his concerns regarding your fitness for practice." Brooke didn't respond. Responding would be arguing, and arguing would be emotion, and emotion was the thing that got people like her destroyed in places like this. Instead, she picked up her badge, felt its weight in her palm, nothing, really, just plastic and a photograph of a woman who'd been allowed to exist for 3 years and now wasn't, and she put it in her pocket. That evening, Sterling made his calls. The first was to Dr. Chen, board member, who owed Sterling for a referral network that had tripled his practice income 6 years ago. She performed an invasive cardiac procedure without physician authorization, Sterling said, and Brooke could imagine the careful pause on the other end, the moment where Chen understood that a favor was being called in. "I need your support when this goes to a vote." The second was to the director of her nursing school, his voice dripping with the kind of concern that was actually a weapon. "I'm calling to inquire about the quality of training your program provided to Brooke Sullivan, given her recent serious breach of protocol. The caliber of judgment she demonstrated is frankly alarming." The third was to the State Nursing Board investigator, and Sterling's tone shifted there, became the voice of an expert, someone whose testimony would matter. "I'm happy to provide expert analysis about her pattern of insubordination and reckless decision-making. This incident, I believe, represents a dangerous escalation." He hung up satisfied, and his assistant brought him the updated chart on Patterson, stable, transfer to ICU, prognosis excellent. Sterling's jaw tightened like he'd bitten into something rotten. He pulled up the patient's file and wrote a new entry in his own handwriting, patient outcome positive despite unauthorized intervention by unlicensed personnel. The word sat there on the screen, a revision of reality that was technically true and completely false at the same time. The ranger would live because of the unauthorized intervention. That's not how the chart would read, though. The chart would read that Sterling had managed the care and the patient survived, and the intervention would become evidence of negligence, insubordination, overreach. That night, Brooke stood at her husband's grave in Houston's Rest Lawn Memorial Park, rain hammering the ground like applause for something nobody was celebrating. The headstone read, "Captain James Sullivan, U.S. Army, beloved husband and father." The dates under his name covered 38 years, 3 tours, and 1 moment of vulnerability that had cost him everything. She knelt in the mud, and her feet in those combat boots that leaked water through the cracked leather sent cold into her bones. "I saved that boy's life," she whispered, and her voice didn't shake because shaking was a luxury she'd learned not to afford, and it still wasn't enough. "I promised you I'd keep my head down, that I'd stay hidden like they ordered after Sanjin, and I couldn't even do that right." The rain ran down her face. She didn't call it tears. Tears were a choice, and this was just water and gravity and the physical response to kneeling in a graveyard in the dark. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan died with you," she continued, pressing her palm flat against the cold stone. "I tried to stay dead. Really tried. 12 years in the teams, and 3 years pretending to be nothing, and it took for minutes in a trauma bay to remember who I was supposed to be." Thunder rolled across the cemetery like distant artillery. Somewhere in that sound was the answer to something she'd been asking herself for 3 years. She placed her other hand on the grave, and whispered something that was part prayer and part promise: "Maybe some people aren't meant to stay invisible." The rain intensified, and somewhere in the city above her, Dr. Sterling was already making plans for tomorrow: more calls, more documentation, more ways to ensure that whatever Brooke Sullivan had been before today, she would never be allowed to be it again. He didn't know yet that he'd already lost. He was still operating on the assumption that institutional authority was the highest form of power. He had no idea what was coming. The rain fell hard on the cemetery that evening, the kind that soaked through everything. Brooke stood motionless at the granite headstone, James Sullivan engraved in letters that caught what little light remained. The combat boots at her feet, his boots, the pair she'd carried from that field hospital in Sanjin, were dark with mud and water. She'd brought them every visit for 3 years. She always brought them. The silence of the cemetery pressed against her ears like a held breath. No monitors. No pages. No Sterling's voice cutting through her decisions. Just rain hammering the grass and the hiss of wind through the oak trees. She pulled the wet fabric of her jacket tighter, though the cold had nothing to do with the weather. "I saved him," she whispered. The words cracked slightly, the first time her voice had broken since Sterling escorted her from the building. "I saw the signs and I called it and I was right. The boy is alive because I trusted what I saw under that pressure." She knelt, pressing her palm against the wet stone. "But it still wasn't enough. Nothing I do is ever enough." The rain intensified. She didn't move. "You told me to stay buried. You told me after Kandahar that I'd be safer if no one knew, if I just became someone else, someone small. A nurse. Someone nobody looks at twice. And I promised you I would do that. I promised I'd keep my head down and let you rest easy knowing I was hidden." Her voice dropped lower. "I couldn't even keep that promise, James. I saw someone dying and I couldn't look away. I couldn't be small." The cemetery was empty except for her. No one could hear the confession she'd carried for 15 years, the guilt that had settled in her chest the moment she watched his body being loaded into the evacuation helicopter while she stumbled toward the transport, bleeding from a shrapnel laceration across her ribs, screaming his name until the medic sedated her. She'd been Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan then. The Phantom. The woman who'd extracted 12 wounded Marines from that burning field hospital in Sanjin Valley while enemy fire shredded the walls around them. She'd moved through that chaos with the precise clarity that comes only from thousands of hours of training and the knowledge that hesitation kills. But James had covered the south entrance, his M for barking controlled bursts, buying her the second she needed to move the last casualty. He'd stayed too long. He'd always stayed too long. The Navy Cross had come 6 months later, the citation classified because the operation she'd saved people from had never technically existed. 15 years of citation she couldn't acknowledge, rank she couldn't use, a name that had been scrubbed so clean from every official record that even she'd started to forget the woman who'd worn it. The Pentagon had been explicit: if anyone found out she'd survived that operation, the intelligence assets still embedded in Helm and Province would be exposed. So she'd become Brooke Sullivan, registered nurse. No middle initial. No history. No glory. No James. The boots were the only thing she'd kept. They were his, and she carried them because losing them would mean losing the last piece of proof that the classified woman had ever been real. She stayed at the grave for another hour, rain streaming down her face, her hands pressed flat against the stone as if she could reach through it and press her palms against his for one more second. By the time she drove back to her empty apartment, the sun had completely disappeared, and her clothes were plastered against her skin like a second layer of guilt. 200 miles away in the Mercy General ICU, the young Army Ranger named Patterson opened his eyes on the morning of day 2. His breathing was easier now. The oxygen they were giving him felt less like a luxury and more like something he could actually use. His mother was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand resting on his arm, but his father was standing at the window, watching the Houston skyline come alive with sunrise. "Dad." His voice was rough from the intubation they'd removed during the night. "Did I dream that? The nurse?" His father turned. Colonel Marcus Patterson had spent 32 years in the Army, had seen combat in 3 different countries, had buried more friends than he'd made in his first decade of service. His face was carved from decisions made under fire. "You remember something? When they were moving me from the ER. Everything was spinning and I heard a woman's voice. Completely calm. Like she wasn't scared at all. And when I was going under, I saw her face for maybe a second." Patterson's breathing quickened slightly, his heart rate ticking up on the monitor. "I know that face, Dad. I've seen it before. In the hospital." "No. In the teams. The briefing for that operation in Kandahar. I was just a junior enlisted then, watching from the back, but there was a photograph on the classified brief. The woman who got everyone out of the field hospital after it was hit." Patterson grabbed his father's wrist with surprising strength. "Her call sign was Phantom. Dad, I'm telling you, that nurse is Phantom. That's Senior Chief Sullivan." Colonel Patterson's entire body went very still. He looked at his son for a long moment, then walked into the hallway and made a phone call to a number he hadn't dialed in a decade. The person who answered owed him a favor from a deployment in 2007. By the time he finished the conversation, 3 other calls had already been placed. The machinery of the military, when activated by someone who knew how to use it, moved with terrifying speed. In the ICU, Dr. Sterling arrived for morning rounds at 7:48 a.m., his white coat pristine, his stethoscope draped like a medal across his shoulders. He reviewed the Ranger's chart with a satisfaction that made his jaw set slightly higher. The family was in the room, he could see them through the glass. The mother was awake now, both parents flanking the bed like sentries. "Your son was fortunate," Sterling said, his voice carrying the kind of patronizing tone he reserved for families of critical patients. "The procedure was unorthodox, but I supervised the intervention closely. Very hands-on." Colonel Patterson turned from the window slowly. His military bearing, which he'd been keeping subdued for his son's sake, suddenly became apparent in the way his shoulders squared and his eyes tracked Sterling with the precision of someone who'd been trained to assess threats. "You supervised?" "Yes. I was present for the entire procedure. Your son's life was in my hands, so to speak." "That's not what my son says." The colonel's voice remained calm, but it had dropped into a register that made the residents at Sterling's back take a step away from him. "He says a nurse saved his life while you froze." Sterling's smile tightened. "Your son was sedated and crashing. He couldn't possibly remember procedural details accurately. The human brain under crisis doesn't. My son is a ranger. He's trained to observe and retain tactical information even under duress. He says he remembers a woman's hands moving while you stood motionless." The colonel stepped closer, and Sterling suddenly understood with crystalline clarity that he was facing someone from a different world than the one he'd been dominating for 13 years. "He says that nurse has been fired. Is that true?" Sterling's face hardened. "That nurse overstepped her scope of practice. I have documentation of—" "I don't care about your documentation, Doctor." The colonel pulled out his phone. "I've made some calls. You'll want to be in the hospital lobby in about 3 hours. Bring anyone who helped you fire that nurse. They'll want to hear what comes next." Sterling laughed, but it sounded hollow even to himself. "Is that a threat?" It's a promise. The colonel's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the expression of a man who'd made many promises in combat and kept every single one. You destroyed the wrong person's career. Sterling retreated to his office, and the calls began immediately. He dialed a board member, then the hospital administrator, then his attorney. With each conversation, his voice became more assured. This was his world. This was how institutions worked. You had allies. You had documentation. You had a narrative that was already in the record. Some nurse who'd gotten emotional would be nothing against the full force of his institutional power. But his hands shook slightly as he dialed. 3 hours later, the automatic doors of the Mercy General lobby hissed open, and the sound of boots on tile echoed through the corridor in a precise cadence that made every civilian head in the room turn slightly. Boots like that meant someone had trained them to walk that way. Brooke Sullivan, standing in civilian clothes near the information desk, summoned by a call she didn't understand, felt her spine straighten as if responding to a command that hadn't been spoken yet. The footsteps belonged to a Marine lieutenant in dress uniform, his bearing so perfect it looked like a photograph, and when he approached her directly and came to attention, her breath caught. It was her son. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan," he said, his voice parade ground steady. The words hit her like shrapnel. Her hands began to tremble. Not from fear, she'd stopped fearing things around the time her husband died, but from the recognition that everything she'd buried was about to be exhumed in front of witnesses. Behind him came a Navy SEAL commander in dress whites, carrying a manila folder with red classification stamps that caught the fluorescent light. The folder had her name on it in typed letters. The commander approached with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent 2 decades moving through conflict zones, and he handed her the folder without ceremony. "Senior Chief, your records have been declassified by order of the Secretary of the Navy," he said. Her hand shook violently as she opened it. The papers inside carried dates that spanned 15 years, citations for actions she'd been forbidden to acknowledge, combat records that had been sealed behind classified barriers so deep that the Pentagon itself had essentially erased them. Her eyes blurred over the words. Navy Cross. Bronze Star. 2 Silver Stars. Purple Heart. Recommendations for commendations that had been filed and then buried so thoroughly that no civilian authority even knew they existed. Her son's voice cut through the lobby, loud enough to carry to every corner of the space. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, United States Navy." Her son's voice cut through the lobby, loud enough to carry to every corner of the space. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, United States Navy." Time fractured. The fluorescent lights above seemed to hum louder, or maybe that was just the blood in her ears. Nurses stopped mid-stride. A patient waiting for discharge looked up from their paperwork. The administrator who'd summoned her stood frozen, mouth slightly open, clearly unaware of what was about to unfold in the space between the trauma bays and the waiting room. Her son stood in dress blues, the uniform pressed so sharp it could cut glass. Captain Michael Sullivan, 1st Marine Division. He'd inherited his father's jawline and something else, that particular brand of calm that comes from knowing exactly who you are and never needing to prove it to anyone. Behind him, the Ranger stood in his own uniform, arms still favoring the left side where the shrapnel had carved through his ribs. Patterson. His eyes were clear. Alert. The eyes of someone who'd been briefed. And behind them both, the man in civilian clothes but carrying himself with the kind of authority that made the hospital's fluorescent light seem dim by comparison. Navy SEAL Commander. The insignia was subtle, DevGru patch visible for just long enough to register before his hand moved to cover it. He held a manila folder, the kind that made security clearances seem quaint. Brooke's hands didn't shake. They never did. Her breathing didn't accelerate. Combat had taught her that the body betrays fear before the mind admits it, so she'd spent 15 years training her body to lie. "Mom," her son said, and the word landed differently than it ever had before. Not a child's voice calling from a soccer field. A Marine officer's voice, formal and certain. "There are people here who need to talk to you." The SEAL commander moved forward, his movements economical, no wasted steps, no wasted gestures. He introduced himself by name only, no rank given, which meant his rank didn't matter because his authority transcended it. He extended the manila folder. Senior Chief, we've been authorized to declassify certain materials related to your service record. She took the folder. Her hands felt like they belonged to someone else, steady, precise, someone who'd learned a long time ago how to compartmentalize shock. Inside, the first document made her breath catch. Just slightly. Just enough that only her son would notice, and he did, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Navy Cross. Her name. The date, Sanjin, Afghanistan, 15 years ago. The next page, Silver Star. Then another. 2 silver stars. Purple Heart. And beneath each citation, the operational details that had been so thoroughly classified that even she'd stopped remembering them in full. Mission details. The names of the 23 people she'd carried out of that field hospital while rounds punched through the sandbags above her head and her husband covered the exit, bleeding into the dust with a hole the size of a fist in his chest, still firing. The words blurred. Not from tears, she wouldn't allow that, not here, but from a kind of temporal vertigo, like watching your entire erased self documented in official language you weren't permitted to acknowledge. Senior Chief Sullivan saved 23 lives during a siege operation in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, the SEAL commander said, loud enough that the gathering crowd, and there was definitely a gathering crowd now, staff members drifting closer, security standing uncertain at the perimeter, could hear every word. She led an evacuation of the field hospital under sustained enemy fire while suffering a critical GSW to the left shoulder. She continued operations for 4 hours before losing consciousness. The field hospital was completely overrun 12 minutes after extraction. A patient in the waiting area gasped. A nurse Brooke recognized from day's shift, Jenkins, pulled out her phone. Recording. Ms. Sullivan's service record was classified to protect intelligence assets and ongoing operations, the SEAL continued, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, all power, barely contained. She was ordered to transition to civilian life, and she accepted that order with the same integrity she demonstrated under fire. She has lived the last 15 years in deliberate invisibility, never seeking recognition, never discussing her service, honoring her commitment to operational security. The Ranger stepped forward then, his uniform still crisp despite the visible effort of standing. Senior Chief saved my life in this hospital 3 days ago. She identified a medical emergency that another physician missed. She performed an emergency pericardiocentesis that prevented cardiac tamponade from killing me. That's medical terminology for the fact that she put a needle in exactly the right place while someone else froze, and it kept my heart beating. The lobby went so quiet you could hear the rain starting outside, hammering the glass doors like applause from a crowd that knew something everyone else was about to learn. Then the Marine General arrived. He moved through the automatic doors like weather systems rearranged themselves, the air pressure changed, and everyone felt it. 3 stars on his shoulder. He was flanked by what appeared to be legal counsel and someone with a DOD insignia so official it made the hospital administration look like a high school drama club. The general moved directly to where Dr. Sterling had appeared at the edge of the gathering, trying to retreat toward the surgical wing with the desperation of a man who suddenly understood the magnitude of his mistake. Dr. Sterling. Not a question. A designation. You are terminated from your position at Mercy General effective immediately. Your medical license is under review by the DoD Inspector General's Office for retaliation against a decorated service member. You will cooperate fully with that investigation, or we will ensure that cooperation becomes mandatory. Sterling's face drained of color like water from a punctured bag. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing emerged. The administrator beside him took a step backward, creating visible distance, the institutional cowardice of people who smell liability. We take care of our own, the general said, and somewhere a camera flashed, and somewhere else another camera caught the whole sequence, Sterling's face, the general's absolute authority, the ranger in uniform and the marine captain in dress blues and Brooke Sullivan standing in the center of it all, wearing scrubs and combat boots, holding a folder that detailed 15 years of her life that had been officially erased. the next 18 months compressed into their essentials: hearings, media cycles, investigations that concluded in the inevitable direction once the declassified materials were examined, once the 23 lives saved in Kandahar gave testimony, once the operational security blanket was lifted and Brooke Sullivan became Brooke Sullivan instead of the invisible woman who'd let everyone assume she was ordinary. But the real transformation happened 6 months after Sterling was quietly processed out of the medical system entirely, after his medical license was suspended pending ethics review, after 3 separate media outlets documented his career decline with the inexorable patience of people documenting gravity. He'd tried to transition back to practice. Couldn't. Tried to relocate. His reputation preceded him like a smell. Tried consulting. No one would hire him. His wife divorced him. His daughter stopped answering his calls. By month 9, Dr. Sterling taught CPR basics at a community college for $15 an hour, 5 days a week, to students who checked their phones and didn't listen and occasionally recognized him as the doctor from that viral video, the one where the general had terminated him on camera in a hospital lobby while news crews documented every moment of his face draining of color, every moment of his authority collapsing like a structure built on sand. One of his students asked him once, about 3 months into the assignment, if he was that doctor. Sterling said nothing. Just continued showing the mannequin how to perform chest compressions. The student showed another student the video. They watched it on a phone screen, laughing at the moment when Sterling's face goes white. Sterling saw himself reflected in that small bright screen, saw the man he'd been, arrogant and certain, and then saw the moment that certainty died in real time. He never brought it up. Never explained. Never tried to rehabilitate his image. There was no image left to rehabilitate. Meanwhile, 18 months after that day in the hospital lobby, Brooke Sullivan stood in the Oval Office wearing dress white she hadn't worn in 15 years, the uniform fitting like it had been tailored yesterday. The fabric was stiff in the way dress whites always are, immaculate, precise, official. Her son stood at her right shoulder in his marine dress uniform. The ranger stood at her left, now fully healed, his eyes clear and focused. The president held a small blue box. Medal of Honor. The award delayed 15 years by classification restrictions, by operational security, by the necessity of keeping some truths buried until the world changed enough to acknowledge them safely. But the world had changed. Brooke Sullivan had changed it by doing nothing except her job with the kind of excellence that couldn't be erased, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be diminished by anyone threatened by her competence. The president opened the box, and the medal caught the light, that particular shade of blue and white and gold that represents the nation's highest recognition. The photographer's flash went off 6 times. The medal went around her neck. "The people I saved in Kandahar are here," Brooke said to the reporter afterward, gesturing to the reception hall where 23 men and women stood in formal wear, faces alive with a kind of gratitude that money couldn't quantify. "The ranger I treated at Mercy General is here. My son is here. The only person absent is the man who tried to erase me, and he's teaching CPR to community college students for minimum wage, wondering why no one respects him anymore." She touched the Medal of Honor resting against her chest. Authority is given by institutions. Courage is given by conviction. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need to stand between death and the people who deserve to live. The room erupted. Standing ovation. Flashbulbs. Her son's eyes glinted with something that might have been pride, might have been the particular kind of respect that only exists between people who understand the cost of what they're witnessing. And somewhere in Houston, in a cramped community college classroom, Dr. Sterling taught chest compressions to indifferent students while the woman he'd tried to destroy received the nation's highest honor, the medal-catching light that would be captured in photographs that would outlive him by decades. His name, once a title that commanded respect, had become a cautionary tale in medical ethics courses. A name whispered in hospital hallways as a warning. A name that meant, this is what happens when you prioritize your ego over your oath. Brooke Sullivan's name meant something different now. It meant, sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everything together. It meant, sometimes invisible people are invisible because they're so busy saving lives that they don't have time for recognition. It meant, the military takes care of its own, and so does honor, and so does courage, and those things are more durable than any institution that tries to bury them. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, then proven them wrong, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss stories about the hidden heroes walking among us. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to discover you were completely wrong about who they were? And share this video with someone who needs to remember that true strength is often invisible until the moment it isn't.